Hey everybody, it's EJ from eyedesyn.com, and today we're going to be talking about how you can optimize your GIFs, or GIFs if you want to say it like a jerk. It's GIF, it's graphical interface, GIF. So we're going to be going over how you can take renders from Cinema 4D and how you can optimize them inside of Photoshop to create the best looking animated GIFs you possibly can, limiting file size and keeping up the image quality. So I'm going to be going over all of the options that are available to you inside of Photoshop. So let's get started with making some GIFs. So we have a few different examples of what you might be creating in Cinema 4D, some animations you may be creating. Here is more of a flatter, stylized kind of look, kind of sketch and toony of some popcorn. And the first thing you want to do is you want to make sure it loops. So I'm going to click this little gear down here, and we can actually make it loop playback. So instead of just having that stop at the end of the timeline, we can actually have this loop. So I'm going to turn on loop playback, and that's kind of the big thing to do is when especially if you're editing anything in the actual timeline in Photoshop, you want to make sure that you don't have any duplicate frames or any popping that happens at the end of your animation. So that's one handy tip to make sure that you have the this loop playback turned on. So once you got your animation in your timeline all set up and good to go, now is when we can go into all of the export options. So we're going to go to export and save for web legacy, which I don't know why this is a legacy thing, because GIFs are pretty dang cool now again, and a very viable platform and file format to share animation. So hopefully it'd be nice if Adobe kind of gives a little bit more love into the save for web interface. So the first thing I want to go over is, first thing you want to do is make sure that you have this GIF selected in this file format, or you're not going to make a GIF. But the first thing you want to do is go into this color reduction algorithm, and by default, selective is chosen. And selected is kind of just a really nice optimized color reduction method that tries to make the best image that is safe for web colors. And like I said, this is the mode by default, and most of the time this is going to be all you need, especially if you're working in like After Effects or more flatter 2D type of stuff. And this example right here, it's very flat colors, so everything's looking good with the selective. But there's these other modes here that I'll actually get into a little bit later, but I'll just go through them now. And one thing you want to do is when you are going through all these different color reduction methods, you want to keep an eye on this file size right here, because a lot of, I know Dribble, I think their file size limit is 8 megabytes. So this is something that you really have to keep in mind when you're sharing on social media. I think Twitter is even less than 8 megabytes. So you really need to optimize, and this is what this whole tutorial is going to be about, is making sure that this number is the lowest it can be and your image quality is the best it can be at the same time. So selective, that's the default. Usually that's going to look pretty good unless you got a lot of images with gradients, and I'll show you a few of those images later on. Perceptual, let's move to perceptual. So perceptual is very similar to selective. The only difference is that it's actually making colors that make your little eyeballs happy, that your eyes can really see the difference of what colors you can perceive. Hence the name perceptual. So it's all about making your eyeballs happy and just kind of optimizing in a way that any subtle color changes is really not going to be that perceivable by the eye with this mode. And we can actually toggle between selective, which is 1.4, 1.25 megabytes in perceptual, and we'll see that even though we had a slight color shift in the blue background there, it's actually looking pretty good. And for flat backgrounds like this, you'll notice that, this color kind of shifted. Hopefully you can see that as I toggle back and forth. Just a very subtle shift in that blue hue. And we actually want to keep this file size low. So what we can do is use the color reduction algorithm that optimizes our file size the most. And we can actually selectively select this blue background color by grabbing this eyedropper tool, selecting the eyedrop, and that's going to highlight that specific color in our color table. Now these are all the colors that exist in our image, and you can see there's 256 colors in our palette, and you can also see that represented up here as well, that we can actually adjust this down to 128, 64, all that good stuff. And usually you'll pay attention to that when this file size is pretty high, but 1.28 is not bad at all. So once we have that color we want to isolate and kind of change, we can double click that highlighted color in our color table. That's going to bring up the color chip, the color picker, and we can freely adjust this to say like a lighter blue and hit OK. And that'll actually update our blue color. So we can really hone in on certain colors. And like I said, if you have that kind of color shift and it's way off, you can always go back in there, isolate that one background color or whatever colors in your scene that you want to change, and just change it to whatever you like. So that's a very handy tip, and that's actually too blue. So that is perceptual. Adaptive kind of takes a look at all the colors in your scene and tries to just isolate those shades. So if you see selective and you look at the color table here, we can see we have a lot more whites, white colors, but adaptive is trying to look at all the colors in your scene and just isolate by color shades. So that is kind of what selective or what adaptive does. Is you can see we have a lot more evening out of the whites, the reds, and the blue. And some of these other modes might be more heavy, like light blue, and there's a lot less red. So adaptive kind of just evens out all the colors. Sometimes this might be good, sometimes this might be worse quality. And then we also have restrictive, which is restricting. You can see this limited color table right here. It really restricts it to just web colors, and you can see that really sliced our file size in half, but it also made our image look pretty crappy. So typically I don't use restrictive very much because this is more for like, those really old crappy animated web banners and stuff, and you can see that really degraded kind of, it looks like someone applied a threshold from After Effects effect on this and just crapped it all up. So typically don't use restrictive. Usually I use perceptual, selective, or adaptive, and then adjust some of the colors here. So for this instance, like I said, selective is what the default option is, and this works perfect for this image right here. Let's go on to another image that actually has, this is another Cinema 4D render that has some ambient occlusion and some graininess in here, so it's not all flat color. So let's just go ahead and open up the save for web for this little animation here. So basically what we did is we introduced more noise, we introduced more gradation of colors, so that's something we're going to have to mess around with in this composition. So you can see this is again the default selective, and we also have a file size of 1.5 megabytes, and this is a 100 frame animation. And you can see that selective works pretty good. The only thing is right down here, if I can zoom in on here, we're really getting some cruddy, noisy kind of our ambient occlusion from Cinema 4D is looking pretty scruffy right now. It's not looking too hot. So we want to actually, selective is fine. We have all the colors represented. We can actually see what perceptual looks like. and see if that looks any better. We're getting a little bit more shades, but again, we're having this gradation be very, very chunky and noisy. So the next thing I'm going to go over is this dither. And what dither is going to do is try to simulate colors or blend colors that aren't in your scene and try to make it look like a smooth gradient. So it does it a few different ways. We can use diffusion, which is just noise. So it's going to apply noise and kind of mix these colors together. But again, we already have noise, so that's really not going to help. We actually have another different type of noise here as well. So they're just random patterns, and you can see that that kind of looks okay, but again, it still looks pretty noisy. The option I like to use the most is this pattern. It just is more uniform, and for me, it just makes it look less cruddy. So you can see that it's kind of spaced evenly here, and we're at 200%. So when I shrink this down, you can see that actually the pattern doesn't look too bad. It looks like when it's an even pattern all throughout, trying to blend the colors together, you can see that our gradient here on the orange and the pineapple here, it looks a lot smoother with that pattern. And I just really like the pattern look. It just looks a lot better to me. But that's just me in my eyeballs. Your eyeballs might like another version, but you can see that on these details of the pineapple, you can really see those little arcs, like the little whatever the texture is on this pineapple. You can see it with the pattern. You get that pattern lost with that diffusion, and noise actually works pretty good too. So actually noise isn't that bad, but I just really prefer pattern. And again, there's not a whole lot of difference between pattern and noise. It's kind of like your preference, whatever you like. If you like a pattern, if you like noise, it's all up to you. Have some fun. It's a free country. You can do what you want. So that is kind of with dealing with subtle gradients. So let's go on to a new composition, and this is like your more typical C4D render. We have reflections, we have shiny textures, we have a lot of colors here, we even have a gradated background here. So there's a lot more color information in this image versus the two images that we just went over. So let's just go ahead and see how we can tackle this animation. And as the Safer Web pops up, it's loading in all of my frames here. And another thing you want to keep in mind is when you're importing these animations is you really make sure that, for the colors, this image, you probably want to keep the colors fairly high, but those previous two images, you could probably get away with 128 or 64, but again, the file size was so low on those that it really doesn't hurt that much to just go for broke and just be like, hey, yeah, the more colors, the merrier. So in this image, it actually isn't that bad either. At 256, especially with a lot of gradients, you want to try to not touch that at all. You want the most amount of colors because we have such a rich color palette as it is, so much gradation and stuff like that. So basically what I did, and we're at 2.3 megabytes right now, and again, I'm going to set this back to the default selective color reduction algorithm, and you can see that we have this banding of our gradation, or of our gradated background, and this does not look too good. And even on my little workout carrot guy here, we have bands of color and stuff like that. So again, we can go and see the difference between perceptual and selective and kind of look at the file size. That really doesn't change it all that much. We got 2.29, and this doesn't change much. Adaptive, let's see what that does. You can see a little bit of color shifts, kind of smooths out some of the gradients, but we still have a pretty small file size. But the main thing that we're going to run into with typical 3D renders from Cinema 4D and trying to make GIFs out of them is this banding, the color banding. So this is where that dither really comes in. So again, diffusion is probably not going to look too good. It's probably going to really crud up our image, and you can see the file size just skyrocket. You can see that it went to 11, almost 12 megabytes. So Diffusion, not the most, not the lightest type of dither. So let's go ahead and try the pattern, my favorite pattern. And you're going to see that this is kind of taking a little while. And the reason why that is because we have 87 frames, and it's actually, Photoshop is actually applying this dithering effect to all of those frames. So that's why it's going to take a little bit. You can see with pattern, we just went from almost 12 megabytes or 13 megabytes to 3. And you can see that our image is still pretty dang good. And I can zoom in here, and you can see that, yes, when you're zoomed in pretty close, you can kind of see all these individual pixels. It's kind of like an LED TV, where if you're far away, it looks like a smooth image, but once you like put your face right up against the TV, you're going to start seeing those little RGB little pixels, and you know, with CRT TVs and stuff like that. Like, this is kind of the same thing, where if I zoom out, everything looks nice and smooth, but you can see that we have that pattern working in there. So this is pattern. Let's go ahead and see what noise looks like. So we've got 3.3 megabytes here. And again, the dithering is being applied to all 87 frames of our animation. So you just got to be patient with Photoshop. It's doing the best it can, dang it. So you can see noise. It looks it almost looks worse. But again, if you zoom out, it actually still looks kind of bad. Like, it looks bad compared to pattern. If I could just toggle between the two, I really like the evenness of the overall pattern that is applied to every part of the image, because noise is gonna differ throughout your image. Pattern's more consistent, and we all like consistency. Pattern's always gonna be there for you to help dry your tears when your file size is too large. So what we're gonna do now is, let's just see if we can optimize this even more. Even though 3.3 megabytes is not bad, let's just see what happens when we go down in our color palette. So we're going to have it basically go from 256 to 128. And again, here's our color table with all the colors in it. And actually, you know, it halved the color, but our image really didn't degrade all that much. You can see the difference between the two. Nothing really changed that much, but we did save, you know, almost, half a megabyte, which, you know, if you have a longer animation, that's really going to add up over the course of your animation. So we can try 64. And this is basically what I do, is when I get to the right kind of dithering, I really try to see how far I can push the amount of colors in my scene. So you can see 64. We're starting to see a lot more of that pattern show up, and it's using less colors to create that pattern and make that gradient. So I'd say the jump between 64 and 128 is much more dramatic than 256 to 128. So again, just play around with your images and stuff like that. And then the last thing I'm going to go over is this web snap. And what the web snap really does is it tries to push all of your images or all of your colors to more web safe colors. So this is kind of a way to adjust and limit your color table based on what is considered web safe, or whatever is going to show up in browsers more consistently with the more consistent colors. So we're at 2.6 megabytes right now. Typically what I like to do is keep it between 0% and like 45, because once you get past 45 and start getting to these higher levels of web snap, things start to get pretty crazy with the colors. So I'm going to choose 40, and we'll just see what happens. So we'll pay attention to this megabyte down here. So 2.6, we got 40% web snap, and again, it's so we only saved, so it was 2.6. Now we're down to 2.5, and really our image didn't degrade all that much. So 40 is pretty good. And again, but if you go over 50%, so if I do like 70 or 71, We'll let this thing work. And again, these little highlighted colors are the web safe colors that it's going to try to pull all of these color ranges into. So you can see that once we got to 70, colors really started shifting, and our image quality really started to degrade there, because even though we have 128 colors here, look at how small our color table is. It actually, by doing the web snap, we actually only have 99 colors in our palette because of that web snap. So kind of play around with this. Sometime you can dramatically decrease your file size with this web snap. Sometimes it doesn't make all that much a difference, especially with an image with so much color information in here. So just keep that in mind. So this web snap, if I go back and revisit, let's actually go back and revisit our first popcorn scene and really push, see how, and really see how small a file size we can get with all of these options that we've been covering throughout this tutorial. So again, we have 1.425. That's our starting point. Let's go ahead and let's see what 64 colors looks like. And we're almost down to below 1 megabyte. So let's do the web snap now. Do the web snap. Sounds like a dance or something. And we'll crank this up to 39. So actually we only have 56 colors, and we're below 1 megabyte, which is nice. And let's just see how far we can push this. Maybe 80? Let's see what 80 web snap does. And again, you can see that now we're really starting to get some really chunky gradients, some really noisy edges, and our image quality is not looking too hot. And again, that's because we're now using 38 colors. So we can always, use the highest amount of colors and then try to web snap it down to some web safe colors. And you can see that we started with 256, but with the web snap at 80%, we now basically halved our color palette. So we're at 121. So another handy thing is we can actually go into our color table and select colors. So maybe we decide we have way too many blue shades in here that we really don't need. We can actually go in here and select all the colors that we think we don't need. So maybe stuff like this, and we can just trash them. So we can actually get our the colors in our palette down by just deleting color chips. So now we're down to 113. And you can see that our image really didn't change. So that's kind of like if you really, really want a lot of control over really trying to push how light your GIF animation can be in file size. You can go color by color in your animation and just trash certain colors. So that's that. So we did our workout carrot. Now the final thing, so basically what I want to do is typically in animations, if you can get away with it, don't have gradations in the background, especially if you can just get away with a solid color. Because something like this, you not only have to calculate and smooth out the shadow here, this like area shadow from Cinema 4D, but you also have to smooth out this gradient. So typically, here's another animation, my little goth monster lady person. And you can see that it's the same kind of composition. We still have the reflections. We have a ton of color in here. We got specular, all that good stuff. We have an area shadow here as well, but we have a flat background here. So that's going to be something that will be very helpful when we try to keep this file size down. So let's go ahead and open up our save for web. And this selective is going to be very helpful when you do have images with a lot of gradient, because again, we have all this chunky stuff that we need to apply dithering to try to smooth out the gradation of the color on our little monster person. And again, our file size is fairly high. That's 6 point. Usually you want to be below like 5 megabytes, and we're over 6. So let's go ahead, and again, my favorite is pattern. So we're going to go pattern, And we'll just let this go, and this is going to smooth out and interpolate, and you can see that just adding pattern really helps smooth out all of this stuff here. And I want to show you one major difference, and the one nice thing about selective, when you have an object with a lot of gradation, a lot of colors, but then you have a flat background, you can see that our pattern is only existing where there's shadow or slight gradation, but there's no pattern where there's just flat color. And selective really does a really good job of not applying a pattern to the background as well. So what we can do, and I can see my file size just jacked up here, so that's something to keep in mind too. But you'll see the difference if I use something like perceptual as this goes through here. And again, applying the selective color reduction algorithm, and you're going to see one huge difference. Well, one being that our file size went way down, but the bad thing is now we have this pattern where there used to be flat color. And if I zoom out here, you're going to really see that pattern show up very slightly, but it kind of looks pretty bad. If we use noise, it's going to probably do the same thing, only without that nice little consistent pattern. You can see how bad that looks. That looks even worse with the noise, but again, our file size is fairly low. So that's the thing you want to kind of keep in mind, is this perceptual. Let's see what we can see what adaptive does. And as adaptive kind of applies to our scene, I'm going to then change our noise back or our dither back to pattern. And you can still see that even adaptive still has all the graininess and stuff like that going on. Even though our color here looks good, but that background is just really no bueno. So again, selective really helps clean up that background. We don't have any patterns applied to it. You can again go to web snap and try to really optimize this image down. So web snap at 40, we currently have 256 colors here, and you can see that that really didn't limit our file size. So let's try 128 and see if that'll help by limiting our color palette to 128 colors. You can see that we got our file size down to 6.6 megabytes, which is still, it's pretty good, I guess. But I mean, this is where you really need to start pushing all of these little options and pushing the web snap and trying to get as small a file size as you possibly can. It's just a lot of trial and error, and you know, a lot of times, so you'll see I just web snap the crap out of this, and you can see that that blew out a lot of the detail of our shadow, but you can see that our file size is really low. It just went from 6.6 to 2.7. So we can say that, all right, well, 70% was a bit too much. That maybe was a little bit of overkill. So we can try, say, 55. So, you know, you crank in the type of color reduction algorithms, you crank in the different types of diffusion you can add, play with the colors, see how far down you can get with that. And then once you get to a point, just start playing around. This is like the web snap is one of the final things I start playing around with when really trying to get my image down to a certain size. And you can see that just going from 55 to 43, that just brought back all of my colors. So this is kind of touchy. It's a little bit sensitive with the web snap here. And again, you can see that green color kind of shifted. So again, I can go in here and eyedrop that green color, and there it is selected right there. I can go in here and say, no, this was like had a little bit more saturation in there, and hit OK. And wait for it. So again, this is applying it to all of a color, and that's actually a little bit too hot. But you can see the point there is if you try to get a little bit too, if you try to punch that color up too much, you can start to see that, well, this shadow's edge is kind of creating this halo effect. So you want to be careful with how far you push that selective color replace there. But yeah, that is it. This is how you can create a fun animated GIF from your Cinema 4D file. So one final thing is that you want to make sure when you make these looping animations from Cinema 4D and you bring them into Photoshop and you do this save for web, you want to make sure you have this looping option set to forever. You want to loop forever, right? So just make sure that that's set to forever. You can also go in here and change the image size. So sometimes if you're flexible with your image size, this can really bring down your file size a lot. So maybe try 600 by 450, I believe the ratio is. And again, as far as quality, I've found that the nearest neighbor really maintains really sharp edges with your animations and stuff like that. So just some little final happy little tips there for you. And again, click save and you'll save it out as a GIF. But that's about it. And hope you guys learned something. So if you're creating something in Cinema 4D, no matter if it's flat with the sketch and tune look, or it's got a little bit of noise and ambient occlusion, or if you got a little workout carrot with a gradated background, or you have a typical render with just a flat color as your background, you are now equipped to use that save for web command and really try to make the best quality GIF animations you can deliver to the interwebs. So hope this is very helpful for you guys. If you make animated GIFs, I'd love to see them. I'd love to see what kind of quality you guys come up with for your animations. If you have any questions, be sure to ask them in the comment sections. I'll try to answer them best I can. And as always, thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next tutorial. Bye, everybody.